We already know the dangers of gun-free zones. We know the vast majority of violent crimes occur in gun-free zones, and we know this happens because in these areas, good people are rendered unarmed and helpless, while criminals are not. We should have learned by now that gun-free zones are only effective at disarming people who are willing to follow the law. These are not the people we should be concerned with. Why would a person who's willing to kill in cold blood obey a gun-free zone sign? The idea that some people still see gun-free zones as a way of deterring violence is absolutely absurd, but we still see the virtue signaling from the political left with respect to these dangerous killing zones. Now, many politicians want to have it both ways. They'll support gun-free zones while trying to look like they support an armed citizenry. See, they value their political reputation much more than the lives of the people who put them in office. They can't support carrying in public, no matter how many innocent lives it saves, because they need to sit at the popular table. Unfortunately, there are a handful of Republicans vying for a seat at the popular table and desperate to get the respect of the anti-gun lobby and media. They want to get reelected and oftentimes do it at the expense of the very people they've been elected to represent. So we call these turncoat Republicans rhinos because they're Republican in name only, not in practice, and certainly not in principle. Well, Wyoming Governor Mark Gordon is one of those rhinos, especially when it comes to gun rights and people being able to defend themselves in public. In March of this year, GOA-backed legislation passed the Wyoming legislature that would have removed the majority of gun-free zones in the state of Wyoming and afforded people the ability to defend their own lives and exercise the Second Amendment as our founding fathers intended. Now, the state legislature passed that legislation, and Wyoming has been known as a state that respects the Second Amendment rights of its citizens. And the new legislation banning dangerous gun-free zones was very much welcomed. But Governor Mark Gordon, a so-called Republican, had different ideas about whether the people who live in the state of Wyoming should be able to defend themselves against criminals. In short, he decided that the citizens he represents should not have the ability to defend themselves in various locations throughout the state. And he killed the legislation, which would have given people the ability to protect their own lives and the lives of their families. Now, this legislation that would ban gun-free zones wouldn't have been possible without the extensive efforts of GOA members and supporters, along with GOA's Mark Jones, a Wyoming resident and national director with GOA. Now, Mark and GOA supporters were able to work with pro-gun legislators and challenge fence-sitting legislators to actually pass the legislation. It wasn't easy because the Wyoming legislature is not as red as many people around America believe it to be. Even though 92% of Wyoming legislators are Republican, the legislature is very divided in terms of constitutional and conservative values versus liberal philosophies. For proof, there were 10 efforts to destroy the bill on the House floor before it ultimately passed. Now, each vote involved a hard fight to protect the legislation. Furthermore, after the bill passed the House, Mark Jones and GOA supporters were able to work in the Senate to successfully resurrect the bill from a kill committee, where the Senate killed it on a Monday night. On a Tuesday morning, because of the hard work by Mark Jones and others, senators pulled the legislation directly onto the Senate floor, even though the Senate Judiciary Committee had killed it. Now, after it ultimately passed the Senate, this was when the Wyoming governor, a true rhino, vetoed this historic legislation. He did this after the legislature adjourned and after he made a campaign promise to sign a repeal of gun-free zones if one ever made it to his desk. Well, he lied, he got the votes he needed, and turned on the very people who supported him. The actions of this governor's veto forced efforts to override the veto by calling a special session of the state legislature. Again, Mark Jones and GOA took the lead in calling for a special session of the legislature, and Mark even had an op-ed in Cowboy State Daily challenging the governor on the veto. As Mark Jones stated in Cowboy State Daily, Governor Mark Gordon just vetoed historic legislation to repeal most of Wyoming's gun-free zones, and his reasoning is incredibly dangerous for constitutionally protected rights. In a foolish statement accompanying the veto, Gordon cited concern over infringing on local control to justify the decision, and it's imperative the public understand the ramifications of this flawed logic as their lawmakers in the state legislature weigh a special session and potential veto override. Mark went on to point out, by asserting that a local authority should have control over one's constitutional rights, the governor is diluting the robust protections the Constitution guarantees. At the end of the day, the Wyoming Senate voted in favor for the special session to fight the governor, but the effort fell short of the votes needed in the House to reconvene the legislature and override the governor's irresponsible veto. Now, the actions of this governor have galvanized citizen support in restoring Second Amendment rights in the state of Wyoming. This has also shown us that GOA activists have proven that they have the power to get bills like this through the legislature by a wide margin. We're confident that this bill will find its way to the governor's desk again after the 2024 Wyoming elections. And we have to hope that in the 2024 Wyoming primary, Wyoming Second Amendment supporters will do everything they need to do to ensure that there will be a veto-proof majority in both the Senate and the House. As shown by the House's failure to support a special session, Wyoming needs to see many of its legislators replaced by true constitutionalists who will challenge Wyoming's rhino governor. Thanks for watching Bullet Points. I'm Dan Wos for Gun Owners Foundation. You can find more Second Amendment content and updates at gunowners.com.